And friends, welcome to the studio, and today I'm going to start you on the journey of painting hand-painted signs. Now this is a combination of stencils and painting. Also, I do some of the lettering. I wouldn't say it's by hand. I cheat, is that the word for it? I will print out a word, like this is flowers, and then I will copy it onto my surface that has been base painted like I do for painting patterns. So, and then I'll go over it. I don't try to get straight within the edges, lighten up on that. I just use it as kind of a placement, etc. So I wanted to get you started. What I use for my signs, I started out using used wood or vintage, not vintage, well, recycled, reclaimed lumber. This is a fence board, and all I did was base paint it. I base painted this using some leftover paints of colors I haven't used, and I had in my stash. I've also used house paint to base paint with boards. Now it usually takes a couple of coats because the fence boards are very thirsty. If I were to buy these, I had these sitting around, so they're well dried. A lot of times when you buy lumber at the big box stores or a lumber yard, the wood will still be wet. So you need to stack it, let it dry. Now how you stack it, all right, I was going to just tell you, and so I'm just going to skip to showing you because it's so much easier. I like being able to see things that is being explained to me. So here are my fence boards I purchased. Now these are the ones that are not the 6-inch wide. I think they're supposed to be 8-inch, but they're usually around 7 inches. I didn't actually measure them, but they're the wider cedar fence boards. You also can get them, I've seen them in redwood, but I go with the cedar usually. Now I have these are shim boards, 1x2s. Yeah, 1x2s. And they're just cut in lengths to put between the boards. First I have a set of the 1x2s on the tabletop, flat tabletop, and then I put the board on it. Then I put another set of the 1x2s on it, the board, and then I place the next board, and I continue to stack. Sorry, I got a hair on my nose. So every few days I come out and I will turn these over, both of them actually. Sometimes I'll just take one board off, move the shim pieces, put the board on top, make sure I have flipped it over, and then I do the same with this one. I get to hold it up. And then I replace the boards, make sure I've turned the board over. And that is how I dry my lumber for my signs. Now, another thing I want to mention are these knot holes. These are called knot holes, sorry. So some of these, they still have resin in them, tree resin. And even if you seal them, base coat the sign, this eventually, especially if these are out in the heat or in the sun, that will bleed through. So what I do is I take a little, it's really my little kitchen torch for making creme brulee, and I just heat these and you'll see the resin bubbling up. Now some people say they use like Zinsser or other sealing coats. I have found that it comes through even that. So some of these, if they're especially pitchy, and if your signs are outdoors and in the heat, that can come through. When I'm hunting for pine boards, I try to find as few knots as possible. Also, there is more expensive boards you can get that have very few or no knots. So, but if you're going on the cheap, like a lot of times I do, then you're going to contend with knots. Now, I also go for the rustic look with many of my signs. And I will tell people that they have a rustic look. I'll do a crackle coat, wear off the edges, and I let them know that these knots may bleed and it just goes with the rustic look. But if you want no knots or any bleed through or you want pristine signs, just be aware another type of wood may be preferable. I know there are like pieces of MDF you can get and base coat and what have you. The only trouble with MDF is the corners and edges are kind of soft, so if they bump against anything, it can dent them very easy. But if you're going to put them in a frame, like if you make your own little frame out of 1x2s, 2x2s, or 1x3s, or anything like that, which they're pretty easy to make, then you don't have to worry about the edges being bumped on the MDF boards, but that's just a note about that. So also, if you get you can buy pre-cut pieces from hobby stores, unfinished wood places and whatever, and those are usually like a birch, plywood type material, and those work really well too. But this is how I use the cheap, inexpensive fence boards from the big box store and how I dry them to make sure they're straight. Next up is sanding. So I use a palm sander. This is an orbital sander actually, and I use a higher or a lower grit paper to start off with to smooth it all. I go over it and over it and over it. I think I start with an 80 to get it smoothed down, or all the rough stuffs, including the edges here. These can be really, really rough. And well, you can see even on, well, let me turn it this way. You can see this edge here is super rough. That would all get sanded down and smoothed. And then I would switch the sandpaper to a 200 grit, a 180, 200 grit, to finalize the smoothness down, because the 80 grit will leave marks a little bit, but the 200, 180 grit will make it very, very smooth. And then you're ready, if you've treated the knot holes, if you're going to sand it really well, then you're ready to go to base paint your sign. So I hope you find that part helpful. Also, now, if you didn't want to waste, like sometimes I'll just square off the dog-eared side. You see how it's cut? Sometimes I will cut that to a sign size and then dog ear this edge. And so it would just look like a sign that had the corners cut off. And that's fairly simple to do. Or you can just square it off right here and just trim off that couple inches. All right, so now on into the base painting. So now we have our piece all sanded and ready to be base painted. Now I just dug out a color that was sent to me that I haven't used. It's been on my shelf for a while, so it needs a good stirring. But since I don't see any projects coming up where I'm going to use this, I'm just going to use it for a base paint. And just to use it up, because this is raw wood and just the old cedar fence boards, they are pretty thirsty. So it probably will take a few coats to get the opacity I want. So the first couple of coats will probably be this. Now if I'm having a light background for my sign, I would go in with a light color usually. You can go in with a darker color to go over for base painting, because you're going to go back over it with a light color. Sometimes I will use a dark color if I'm going to crackle coat, and then the crackles will show up at the dark color will show through the crackles. But for now, we're just going to base paint this. And I'm putting on a fairly thick coat. Fortunately, this color has not started to develop the little dry blobs in it, so I don't have to pick them out. But that's what I would do. A lot of times I would pick them out, depending on how rustic I'm going to make the sign. Sometimes I'd leave it in there, and then when I sand it down, those spots just make an interesting texture. So there we go. I don't always sand it after I've base coated it, but sometimes I do, depending on the look I'm going for with my signs. So there is that. Now to base paint, a lot of times, because I want to get more done at once, I use these 2-inch brushes. This is Low Cornell white nylon. I used to get these on Amazon, but then all of a sudden the price just went so high. I haven't priced them recently, so then I started getting another brand. Let me see if I can find it here. Well, it doesn't even have the brand name on it, but they come in a 3-pack of a 3-inch, a 2-inch, and a 1-inch. And I just buy the 3-packs, and the 2-inch I use the most. The other ones I do use here and there, but the 2-inch, I wish they just had 2-inchers in a package, but there. Okay, I'm gonna let that dry. Probably I will put it under a blow dryer to dry it quickly, and then we'll come back and see if it needs another coat or not. One thing I wanted to make sure I told you was make sure you go around the edges with your brush, and I have my brush over in my water tank to get cleaned, so I'll just do it with another brush. But you see how you get these little globs of paint? You need to take those down and just brush them on. You can also base around the edges. The edges are especially thirsty. And let me lean it down here. You see these edges? The paint comes over no matter how careful you are, and you want to blend that in so you don't have a big glop on the edges of your board. Okay, so there's that. So I wanted to show you something. Here is where I base painted. There was something underneath this. I didn't like it, sanded it down a bit, and you see how it didn't cover it completely? Now this is where you would need a second coat of paint. So I'll go back with another little bit of paint that I'm not using that color usually, and I'll just go right over it again. Especially if I wanted another color, fine, but I'm going to go ahead and go back over it with another blue, and then I will put a crackle coat on this one, and I'll show you that in another video, but I'm just going to go ahead and put this second coat on, and hopefully it will do the job of covering the show through there. Now sometimes, like the other board you saw, it had knot holes. Those are darker too, so that is where you may have show through. You don't have to do this perfectly. You could even leave some of the lighter blue showing, because you're really just trying to cover what was underneath. And there you have it. Now I'm going to let you in on a little hint here. When you're painting a design and not just stenciling a sign, the multi-surface paints, like this is the Folk Art multi-surface, other brands have multi-surface as well. It has a satin sheen, and your brush will glide just a little bit easier on the satin compared to the matte. So this is not a multi-surface, this is just a matte, and that's just a clue if you struggle with your strokes really flowing on the surface. So just a little hint there. I don't think either one of these colors that I put on here were a multi-surface, so we'll just work with what we got and deal with the drag with a blending medium, blending gel, something like that to make it glide better.